The key elements that constitute the Savannah Plan are little different from the basic components of most other cities, yet their combination of form is unique to Savannah. This session examines the design and use of each component, beginning with the ward, the neighborhood unit that functions as the modular building block of the plan. Public spaces, including the squares at the center of the ward and the streets that come in at various sizes and types, are considered next. Building lots that come in two types, trust and tithing, which originally represented the public and private land uses, but came to be more nuanced in their usage. Like a family recipe handed down through the generations, these basic ingredients are cherished and protected through much of the city's history, but they are also tweaked and reinterpreted to adapt to the changing physical circumstances and social needs. Paradox abounds in the Savannah Plan, a plan that simultaneously attracts and bewilders because it is simultaneously simple and complex. The component parts that constitute the city's urban form, the rules that govern their arrangement, are simple to describe, but the effects produced by their implementation are complex. This session will discuss these complexities by examining the paradoxical patterns woven into its fabric. So I show here the plan drawn as a figure ground drawing by Alan Jacobs in his book called Great Streets. And just a few comments about the plan here. Savannah is a grid. It's an orthogonal grid, like so many cities in the world, like so many cities in history. There's nothing really new about the gridiron plan that Savannah basically is part of. But the kind of the particularities of Savannah's grid are really unique. It is a grid like no other. If we could list just a few of these qualities, it is a fine-grained grid. That's one of my favorite ways to describe it. It is a human-scaled grid. It's a civic space-oriented grid, a lot of public space. It is multi-centered. It's non-hierarchical. It's rhythmic. It's nuanced. And, of course, it's elastic, as we have suggested. Let me just start with this proposition that it's a grid like no other. Just a few years ago, in 2011, I guess it was, there was a celebration of the commissioner's grid in Manhattan. I thought I would show this in particular for the ICAA people out there, who many of whom are in the New York area, and just poke a little jab here. That is, the commissioner's grid in Manhattan is incredible. Of course, you can see it in this great colored drawing. A plan to lay out nearly all of the island of Manhattan in a relentless series of blocks and streets. And there was a great exhibit for this at the historical the City Museum in Manhattan in 2011 and 2012 that was curated by Hilary Ballin, who published this book, catalog to go with it, The Greatest Grid, The Master Plan of Manhattan, 1811 to 2011. It's curious that Tom Wilson's book on Savannah came out pretty much simultaneously with this, and it's my feeling, for all you New Yorkers out there, that the Greatest Grid title doesn't actually belong to Manhattan, but to Savannah. Great not in its size, but in its complexity. Let's just compare them. Here is Savannah grid and the New York grid in Alan Jacobs' figure ground drawing. Each of these is a 1 square mile section of the city. And of course, in Savannah, we get the whole thing within the mile square. And I think you can see what I mean by fine-grained and nuanced as compared to the New York plan. Let's put a little teeth on this. So the actual size of the Savannah plan is small, right? This is one of its great features. We can look at blocks and streets as we do with any city, but the ward system complicates, nuances the idea of what's a block and even what's a street. If we look at the properties that are bounded by streets and call those blocks, we see that the Savannah half tithing, for example, is 300 by 90 feet. And you can compare that with a New York block that is 900 by 260 feet, shown here at scale. You can see the square footage difference of all of this. This is one of the greatest limitations of the Savannah plan, that is small blocks. Small block sizes, which of course are going to impede large scale architectural development within the city and are going to force the city to be a small-scaled, human-scaled town. And you can compare it with other towns like Philadelphia or Portland, seen here, and just see some of the differences in how the city is laid out. We can make another comparison here, Manhattan on the left, and we can see a rather non-fine-grained, non-nuanced plan. And on the other hand, we can contrast it with Venice, a even more fine-grained plan, more nuanced, and of course, a wildly complicated plan. So Savannah lies somewhere between the two of these as an organized, rigorous, and yet adaptable, and yet fine-grained and humanly scaled town plan. Just to put it in context with contemporary town planning, let's look at Irvine, California, also drawn in the Jacobs book, and you can see Savannah is a town plan, unlike so many American suburbs, that has a high degree of connectivity. That is, everywhere you go in Savannah plan, you're only a few feet away from an intersection, which will get you to the same place by a different route, something certainly not true in many American towns of the 20th century. What this means is that Savannah is a city in its fine grain that has many intersections, something that Jacobs counts in his book. And we can see it ranks near the top, not even close to Venice. I'm not sure how you count that. But it is a city that has more intersections per square mile than almost any American town, certainly any American small town. It means a lot of curb space. It means a lot of infrastructure in the town as well. But what it also means is a lot of public space. The rhythmic character of the town is also fascinating. As you walk through the streets of Savannah, you're passing not just an intersection, but a street of a different kind in this web, this network, this tartan, as we've called it. And it's what I'll call a syncopated plan. That is, you come to a square, and then a street, and then a boulevard, and then another street and a block, and then a square. In a way that can only be described as rhythmic. And it, again, I think is worth contrasting with New York. Pete Mondrian, I think, thought of Manhattan as a rhythmic city. I think he was thinking more about the music and the culture of the city, the excitement of the city. But I think what Savannah has is a plan that actually has the sense of rhythmic patterning embedded into its fabric. If you look at the plan in terms of organization, what we find is that it's a multi-centered plan. Each ward is its own little city. Each ward is kind of ideal plan, as we said, with a square at its center, these public lots facing into it. As one 19th century writer says, he says it's as if 24 small towns got together and had a party, but they're all designed pretty much in the same way. What that creates, though, are some interesting phenomena. Each square acts as a kind of magnet, drawing architectural energy, and of course social energy to itself. Something I've tried to show in this diagram. That means that buildings typically face the square, and restaurants and front doors face onto the square as much as they can. However, when they get to the outsides of the square, that draw is weaker, as if the magnetic pull is a little weaker. And that means that, I didn't diagram this, but some of these streets become alternative magnets. That is, alternative linear, not centers, but linear organizing features. Some of the squares are bigger, some are smaller. Each one is essentially the same, but each one is different in its organization. And of course, there is no center. There are multiple centers. Contrast this with great European cities of the past. There's no Plaza Mayor, right? There's no main city square. And corollary to this is there's no one main civic building facing on to the city square or one main church, as we'll see in the next slide. So it's non-hierarchical. In this sense, the egalitarian goals of Oglethorpe and the trustees, I think, are preserved. That is, there is a sense of almost democracy. Thomas Jefferson talked about wards, using that very word, as his ideal for a democratic society. It has no center, but it does have edges. That is, there are edges to the plan, and so the wards on the east side have a different character to the west side. You can see the west side has those obliterated wards over here. And of course, there's primacy given to Bull Street, as we'll see in just a moment. Let me try to explain a little more of this idea of non-center, of multi-centeredness, by looking at churches and synagogues, houses of worship. Here is a map that shows the location of houses of worship. Now here, I should go back to the founding of the colony. The Georgia Charter, 1732, has some rather remarkable wording in it. One of the stipulations it has is that there shall be no established church, and that there will be free exercise of religion. It's almost the same wording as we have in the Constitution, in the First Amendment. This in itself is remarkable, given that it's an English colony. We don't have the cathedral of the state church in Savannah. But what also is true is that the trust lots were set aside for public buildings. And of course, churches are a primary example of public building. The earliest church was here on Johnson Square, Christ Church. That was the Anglican church to which many of the trustees subscribed and belonged. It's this church that was the Church of John Wesley, for example. And it has a privileged place on Johnson Square, but it's on just one of 4 trust lots. Just up the road is, there it is, and here is the Evangelical Lutheran Church. The Lutherans came as initially as immigrants fleeing from the continent, from the Salzburg area in Austria, to find refuge here in America, and they're given property early on yet a different ward. The Presbyterians were initially given property over here, but then they resided over here, and so forth. There are Baptists over here. That is, there are different forms of expression of Christian worship, and they're located primarily on trust lots, and they're scattered throughout the city. There's no one state church. There are multiple churches. This idea of free exercise, so important to America, seems to be embedded in the plan of the city. So this decentralization of institutions is an important principle. There's hierarchy. There's no stated hierarchy, and yet there is hierarchy. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the streets end up becoming more important than others. And though there was no central street apparent in the plan, in reality, Bull Street functions as an axis of symmetry. It's not actually the symmetrical center, but it acts as an organizing street running north-south, seen here in the Cerveau view of 1837. And we notice here in a plan of the city, this is Bull Street, running through as a central spine through a set of wards. When it gets to the town common here, it continues to be a path. There it is. And you'll notice one other thing about the plan: those garden lots, those triangular garden lots, are angled in such a way as to converge on Bull Street. So though it doesn't appear to have it, it actually does. The plan actually does have this spine, the sense of centeredness, and also something not certainly intended by the plan that strengthens this are monuments placed in the squares along Bull Street, terminated at either end by spectacular architectural visions. The City Hall, placed at the very end, just outside of the plan with its gold dome. At the north end, at the southern end, Forsyth Park, with its spectacular cast iron fountain that completes this axial alignment. So it's non-hierarchical, and yet it's hierarchical. It's multi-centered. It's a vibrant plan. It has multiple readings, paradoxical readings, we might say. Now, that's true of the plan overall. If we look now at the parts of the plan, we can, let's just stipulate what they are, right? There are the tithing lots, as we've noticed, the trust lots, and there are the streets. There are north-south streets, public streets. There are east-west public streets that bisect the plan. They bisect the plan in the manner of a Roman town. And so I'm borrowing the language of Rome and calling the north-south street a cardo, literally in Latin, a hinge, and the decumanus that runs east-west, just like a Roman castrum plan. But then there are the streets that run along the edges of the wards on the east. West, we'll call these east-west boundary streets, and these are thoroughfares. They are, if you're driving, the best way to get through the city, essentially. But there are also streets that run within the wards that are, well, we'll call these neighborhood streets. They're smaller in scale than the bisecting streets, and they accommodate the houses that face onto the ward. But there are also smaller streets yet, the lanes, alleys, you might want to call them, that bisect the tithing lots and allow for utilitarian activities to occur between the back sides of these lots. We'll call those utilitarian streets, and we'll notice that the north-south streets, also rather small, 45 feet, function pretty much as backdoor streets, and yet they also are through streets, allowing traffic to pass through the entire plan. We notice finally that the public square of the city, not designated with streets in the initial drawings, forces the cardo to go around it as if it were a traffic circle, completing this tartan-like plan as I've color-coded it here. We'll go back to that in just a moment. Let's go back to the ward just in terms of its overall size and emphasize again its smallness. The overall ward is really 10.5 acres. If we measure to the center of the streets on either side, which is probably fair, maybe 12 acres is what we'll call it. Yeah, if you count the building lots and subtract that from the street and the squares, something rather remarkable happens. That is, 52% of the Savannah plan is public space. It's not privately owned, but in the public realm. This is another feature of the plan that astounds us in a number of ways. It seems not a tenable way to build in America in these days, to have 52% public land with lots of street frontage as it is. Not an economically viable way to build today, and yet a delightful way to experience a city. The ward is a kind of enigma, like the entire plan. So here's a ward. What exactly is it? We said it's like a little village, a little town plan in its own right, but it is. But it's quite small. So the tithing blocks accommodate 10 houses each. So 40 houses, 40 households per ward. Initially, there were ward captains. It was a kind of administrative unit and conceivably a kind of neighborhood, but a very small neighborhood. Compare it, for example, to the way that we think about neighborhood design in America. I take you to a classic example, the 1929 regional plan for New York, which Clarence Stein gives us a model of what a neighborhood is. And what he gives is a square with churches and community centers and houses radiating out, all found within a radius a radius that is makes it walkable. It's this diagram, of course, that is celebrated by new urbanists and used as one of their beginning points for the design of a traditional neighborhood development. The 5-minute radius or the 10-minute diameter is in fact one of the cardinal rules for new urbanist neighborhood design or American neighborhood design. If we put the Savannah plan in the award in that, you can see that it's only a fraction of this. You can walk from one end to the other of a Savannah ward in 1 minute, maybe a minute and a half or so. So it's really too small to be a neighborhood as we often conceive of it. What this means is that they're not so much neighborhoods, they're small centers that overlap, each pulling with this magnet-like space of the square. Let's look at the other component parts. The tithing lots are pretty straightforward. Here you can see that egalitarianism. You can see it in the drawing, the Gordon view, where everybody's house is tiny, it's the same size. And of course, in the original vision, these houses were not, were autonomous. They were small, 24-foot wide cabins, essentially, with their own fenced yard, one next to the other, regulated like Monopoly board, I think of when I look at these. And of course, each one is the same, but here we find something, right? They're the same, but they won't end up being treated in the same way. A couple of things happen as Savannah is actually built. Many of those lots are actually divided. They're divided in half, sometimes into thirds, to create units that could grow up vertically as row houses, for example, as happens many times over throughout the plan. As the plan becomes denser, the density that the trustees were fearing is actually happening here, but it's happening in a rather remarkable and very successful way with the Savannah row house, which we'll talk about more later on. Not always row houses, though. If you look here, I have two examples of large houses. The Davenport House from 1820, which occupies the front of a tithing lot facing onto a square. And here, a double lot. This owner decided, not content with just one lot, they built a monster house, you might call it, occupying two. But in both of these cases, you'll notice that these privileged lots are the inside lot next to the cardo that faces onto the square. So invariably, the largest and most expensive, most showy houses are going to happen on this inside tithing lot. And there's a kind of hierarchy that happens, right? Non-hierarchical plan, hierarchies emerge. And so you could probably guess that the land value here is higher and a little less and a little less and a little less as we move away from that magnet of a center. You can see this even beyond houses because, of course, as we know, it's not just houses that end up getting built on tithing lots, but very tall buildings, including skyscrapers. Savannah's tallest 15-story Savannah Bank and Trust of 1911 steel frame skyscraper occupies one full tithing lot on that inside space facing onto Johnson Square. Just a couple other examples that do a very similar thing. The trust lots were initially designated to be granted to institutions that were public institutions that needed property. Initially, there was a public oven, there was a guest house, and of course, there was a church. They're called trust lots after the trustees. The word trust lots actually doesn't even used until long after the trustees, curiously. But the idea was that they were meant to be for public buildings and the house lots would be for private houses. Soon after the demise of the trustees, however, houses end up getting built on trust lots, and of course businesses end up getting built on tithing lots. Here you can get a sense of the scale with this one structure here, which is a guest house. But here we see the kinds of buildings that find themselves on trust lots. The trust lot, the same dimension in width as a tithing lot, but 180 to 120 feet in depth, is conceivably an autonomous block. So all sides of a building will be visible. And you can see classic examples of that in some of the churches, or the temple, Mikveh Israel, synagogue, or a courthouse, or a bank, or a government building over here. And you can see how they're prominent buildings. They usually have an on-center doorway that's celebrated in some way, and often using some form of the classical language of architecture, though asymmetries do occur. In the lower three examples I've given you are houses that occupy trust lots. If you are a prominent and wealthy person, you might want to be on a trust lot because it's a more visible, more prominent, more majestic piece of real estate. And a principle develops here, which I find interesting. That is, the house that you will build will be grand and magnificent, following what Aristotle and maybe Alberti refer to as a kind of theory of magnificence, building according to your station, in such a way that the building contributes to the public realm. What's fascinating about this is, though they're private buildings on public lots, initially many of these buildings end up back in the public trust as museums or restaurants, or soon to be a museum in this case, because of the grandeur of their architecture and the public nature of their site. A couple more examples of houses on trust lots. Now, the street pattern, as we said, is part of what makes the Savannah Plan so interesting, and I think delightful and successful. We've already seen it, so let me go through it just a little bit more carefully. There are two kinds of streets: civic streets, including our Cardo, which we see has to negotiate the square, and our decumana. So those are really the organizing streets. You could think of them as the processional streets of the city, the most public streets. And they were designated as 75 feet wide, quite wide for a colonial street in 1733. The neighborhood streets, as I'm calling them, are 37 and a half. In other words, exactly half of the dimension of the public streets. They're more intimate, less trafficked, and I guess you'd say less public. But of course, they overlap with the other streets. They negotiate the square. The through streets, the east-west boundary streets, are the streets that are fronted by the houses facing the outer sides of the square. So they're similar to the neighborhood streets, but they're invariably wider, and they vary. That is, they range from 85 feet in width to 140 feet in width. So these streets actually each have a different character. No two are really exactly the same. The utilitarian streets, as we said, are small. They're 22 and a half, half of 50. And there is some change as the city grows in terms of this dimension, but these are initially were meant to be access to the carriages and the carriage houses that would be placed at the back sides of the lots. In the days of slavery, of course, slave quarters would be established on these lanes, and you can imagine that a kind of culture developed here that would be rather different from the public, genteel, white culture in the front of the houses, at least in the antebellum period. And of course, there's a different culture today. In the northwest, service streets are 45 feet, as we mentioned before, and these really are backdoor streets. There's the square. And it's this that produces that tartan plan we've talked about. We'll notice that the streets actually, in many cases, extend beyond the plan, like strands from the fabric of the plan, connecting it to the larger city beyond. Let's just look at those streets in terms of how they work. Here is the classic example of a Cardo, Bull Street, which we've already mentioned, the street with monuments and monumental buildings, the kind of center, which is this street here. Here you can see it in section, and you can see that it's tree-lined with sidewalks and parallel parking on the side, and grand vistas interrupted by squares. The East-west streets are probably the most useless of the streets, the least used by automobiles, and the most often covered, that is, violated by interrupting, by building buildings that cross over them in the plan. Here we can see Wright Square, and equal in width, as you can see here. The secondary public streets, as we said, are more intimate. The houses encroach upon them with their stairs, also tree lines sliding past the squares. It's these east-west boundary streets that we mentioned that are most different. I'm not going to go through all of them. One acts as a kind of retail main street, Broughton Street. The most remarkable is Oglethorpe Street, which we've already mentioned, formerly called South Broad Street. Here, it was decided to create a street 140 feet in dimension that would have a walking path through the center with vehicular traffic on the sides that would be a space for promenading, a fashionable pastime in the 19th century, which one wonders is why this was necessary in a city with so many squares. I think it's right, though, to think of Oglethorpe Avenue and also Liberty, which does a similar, has a similar design, as linear squares, in that large, gracious houses are built on these wide streets that would otherwise, you would think, be placed on squares. The Independent Presbyterian Church is placed along here. There's one postcard, I couldn't find it, that actually calls this the most beautiful street in America. That might be a little overstatement, but these were certainly seen as amenities and not amenities envisioned by Oglethorpe by any means. You can see the scale with buildings. Broughton Street, as I mentioned, functions as a kind of main street, also not something envisioned by Oglethorpe. And here you can see not a laneway, but a busy thoroughfare with buildings that are a palimpsest of commercial architecture on either side. The lanes have their own peculiar quality. The lanes, which had horses and carriages and enslaved peoples at one time, now, as you can see, have dumpsters and utility lines hiding all of these things from view, from the public realm, and creating this alternative world with its own rather alluring character. And the north-south utilitarian or service streets, as I call them, are peculiar because they're relatively narrow at 45 feet. And in many cases, buildings are backed up to them as a kind of laneway. It's not surprising that several of these have been turned into one-way streets. And it's not surprising that these streets are favored by motorists who are exiting or entering the city from the southern suburbs. The squares are the glory of Savannah, a city of squares. Why are there so many squares? We don't know. Where did this idea come from? Certainly it came in part from the West End of London, which was organized by squares and where many of the trustees actually initially lived. But the Savannah squares are unique. That is, they're not like Italian piazzas. They're not hardscape. They're parks. They're not like the English squares, fenced off from the public, but open to all. And they function in a number of ways. You can see Monterey Square here as a sociable center with a monument in the center. But you can see that they're used by schools and school children. Some were used as playgrounds. There's even a basketball court in one of them. Some are used for monumental architecture, and some were very utilitarian, such as Franklin Square, which had for many years a water tower in the center of it. The squares organize the plan in a very powerful way. You can see from any one square, you can see along the cross-axis the next square. And like a living game, you're drawn from one square to the next. As you're drawn from one square to the next, you're drawn through this park-like tree-canopied space that amazes you as you look at those trees and see how forested this city is. Before I go back to that idea of forests, let's just notice here the traffic circulation pattern. As the squares, from a traffic standpoint, act as traffic circles. They slow down the traffic and force motorists to go around them, while allowing pedestrians to walk right through them. Through a continuous line. So the Cardo is a continuous line for pedestrians such as these. And, when you come to Savannah, you'll see the cars are supposed to stop for you as you continue through the square. So the tartan becomes even more nuanced by this one feature. The last thing that we want to say about this plan is that the trees are certainly an essential element. The literature of the 19th century repeatedly praises the trees, talking about Savannah as rus in urbe, as country in the city. And it's this that tourists even today remark upon, especially the great live oaks that you see on the right, which replaced the chinaberry trees that we see on the left that were destroyed by a blight and the live oak state to the 1890s and later with their massive, strong, cantilevered limbs that form these alleyways. The trees are indeed an important and vital part of the city. For architects wanting to take photographs, they often get in the way, but one can't conceive of the city without them. Trees and other plantings as well. Savannah's plan is agrarian. That is, here, the agrarian ideals of growing various crops like silk, mulberry trees, etc. doesn't happen, but Savannah is a forest city. And in fact, it took on this moniker at the turn of the century and was often referred to as Forest City for reasons that are very apparent. And this seems to be part of what the city planners were thinking when they established Forsyth Park, seen in the lower left here, which was still a kind of pine barren, just as the city had been before it had been established. These trees are part of the architecture of the city. They form colonnades. They provide much needed shade in the hot, relentless summer weather of the city. And they structure the city in a way that is not possible with man-made architecture. With that, I want to leave our examination of the elastic plan, and we'll continue by looking at the architecture. Okay, for our final session, I want to look at the architecture of Savannah. I thought about calling this whole talk the architecture of the Savannah plan, using the word here as a kind of with a double meaning. That is, it's the plan itself, its structure, its architecture that is vital to the success of this real ideal town. But that plan is only an abstraction. It's only a set of lines. It's made real by buildings and by trees and sidewalks and people. But it is in that reality, in the reality of bricks and mortar and stone and trees, that the Savannah plan is made alive. And what we find in the architecture of Savannah is something rather remarkable. The first thing I would say about the architecture of the city, as I often tell students, is there's nothing remarkable about Savannah's architecture. There's not one single building in this city that deserves to be in a world history survey of architecture. There are no truly great buildings in the city. But what the city does have is a remarkable quantity and a remarkable fabric of really good buildings. Buildings that are well built, that are pleasant to look at, that function well, and that work together. As a kind of symphony. We've often used the analogy here of the symphony, that Savannah's architectural fabric is is a kind of symphony without a single conductor. That is, the conductors, the masters we've talked about in the end, have been many voices. And so there are a number of styles and a number of textures and materials that make up the architecture. Yet there is something harmonious. There is something almost musical about the architecture of the city. And that music is not so much guided by a single conductor. Well, let me change that. Let me go back. If there is a conductor, the conductor is the plan, which, as you saw, is a plan made by many people. The plan informs the architecture. As Corbusier once said, it is the plan that is the generator. So I think that's fair to say for Savannah. So what I want to do with Savannah's architecture is talk about how the plan is a generator. And to do that, we just need to go back to the plan. Here is the ward again with its tithing lots. And there are its trust lots. I think I used a different color this time. And we saw how uniform they are and, frankly, boring in terms of the buildings that we see in the Gordon view. But what happens is that the magnetic pull of the center and the conditions of each ward relative to itself and relative to the entire plan form the score that will shape the architecture. We'll just look at a few principles. So for example, this is no particular ward, it's just a hypothetical diagram that shows a tithing that can accommodate, on the one hand, one of our colonial cottages, or row houses, or taller triple row houses here, or large office buildings, or the largest. I'm taking this as a 15-story building. We saw that principle being pulled toward the center. And of course, that will itself guide the architectural design. We notice, of course, that the buildings on a tithing are going to face the street. They're going to face the neighborhood street, or the buildings on the other side will face that boundary street. The lots will often become divided up. There is certainly a general principle that the city over time becomes denser in terms of its architectural fabric. It's a tithing lot is just over 10,000 square feet in size. So if you need a larger building, you'll occupy more and more, if not all, and then you'll go up, as happens not just in office buildings, but in houses. The trust lots, as we said, were autonomous blocks. That is, they're privileged in that one can view them on every side if you build out the entire trust lot, but they're long and they're skinny, they're narrow. They're really kind of awkward in a number of ways. A number of traditions and principles occur here. So you can see in this is a hypothetical house which has been set back because the lot is so deep. You can do that. It has a yard in between, and on the carriage house on the back, kind of supersized version of a tithing lot house. That would be the Odins Thomas house. And here you can see a large block that just maximizes the property to accommodate a business or an apartment building of some kind. But still, with this emphasis toward the street, toward the square. That is, the square is the magnet that draws our attention. And so the architectural refinement happens largely on the facade, with one difference, right? The 75-foot east-west bisecting street means that this street has a sense of grandeur to it. And what is interesting to many is that there are features that occur on the insides of these truss lots, where in some cases you find doorways or passages or balconies which address this east-west street. The house is the principal architectural type in Savannah. We can start with the monopoly-like houses on the Gordon view, and we can find that there are inheritors of this. That is, central hall, one-story buildings. One of the oldest is the Christian Camphor Cottage, which you can see here. Curiously, this house, dating in the 1760s, was one floor before 1871, when it was decided to raise the whole building up on a brick basement to create a two-story building, following the pattern of raising the living level of a house one floor above, which is part of that Savannah tradition. You can see a variation of this in 1798, one of the first raised cottage-like houses in Oddingsell's cottage here on Julian Street. So these little cottage-like houses are really rare. They're not not a main part of the fabric today. Savannah is a city that grows and grows through the 19th century. It's growing because of commerce and trade. Also, it is growing because of a slave-based economy. And real estate speculation certainly does occur. And so we find, actually, as early as the 18th century, owners of properties dividing their properties up and trying to sell or rent houses in multiples. And so it's very common to find what we'll call the Savannah double house. You find this in other cities as well, but Savannah's examples take on certain characteristics that are worth noting. We can see that here in a couple of early 19th century buildings, one a little grander than the other, where you have one tithing divided into two with 3 bay houses with a shared wall in between them. In both cases, we find that the house has been raised up above the street level, almost a full story in the case of the Waring house, and pretty much a full story with the John Ash houses here. Little balconies at this level, gable roof, and dormer windows allowing for an attic story with the John Ash houses, and a low-pitched hip roof and Italianate cornice with the Waring house on the right. Here's a variation of that on East Straight Street from the mid-century, the double house. Of course, what these have would be a side hall plan. And more modest examples on East Charleston Street, also from mid-19th century. The Savannah double house is a way to develop real estate and maximize it, but it becomes a model that is popular for some to build as a single house, a tall single house, also raised above the ground, 3 or maybe 4 stories tall, which has a side hall plan. And various forms of architectural expression and materials, as you can see in these several examples. There are numerous other examples. We find here on the Cummer house an interesting feature. It's also on the Hunter house, but it's cut off here. That is, we have a porch in this Italianate building that's has very tall ceilings here, in some cases 13 feet tall, that leads out to a side porch in a manner, for some of you will recognize this, that's very common in South Carolina, especially in Charleston. And of course, this is reminiscent of the so-called Charleston single house. Though it is a side hall plan, it doesn't function as a Charleston single house, which has a central hall and a false door on the right. So it's kind of ode to a Charleston single house, but a Savannah variation of that. The porch on these seems to be the amenity that makes having a single house rather than a double house worthwhile. And you can have a side garden on the side. These two are actually side by side, and they share a garden in between them. Here at Barnard Street, 1840s house initially was built with another house next to it, and then in the 20th century, that house was demolished and a side porch and a garden was added here. Of course, it's the row house that is one of the stars of the Savannah's architecture. Here, the idea of the double house is just multiplied, and we have numerous examples of rows that include 2 tithing lots or 4 tithing lots or all 5, as in the side on the right. These are the product of real estate developers wanting to make a profit selling ready-to-move-in houses, and there are a number of these. These, in many ways, are the builders of Savannah. A kind of vernacular builder architecture, very simple, very austere. but following the same principles we saw with the single house and the double house of a side hall. Raised above side hall plan, raised above the ground, one full story. Often taller ceilings on the first floor above the ground, and private spaces, and very often very austere. Though they're austere, they become more delicate and nuanced and decorative as the 19th century moves on, and you get quite a variety. You get streets like Jones Street that has an essay on various ways to build a single house, a double house, or a row house. You've got examples of every one of those in the 100 block of Jones Street here in the drawing. These don't all correspond to that same street, but you get some sense of the various facades of these row houses and double houses. And of course, the feature of these Savannah houses that becomes so apparent is the exterior stair. This, again, is part of the plan. That is, early on, because the streets were relatively wide, the city government in the early 19th century allowed for encroachments into the public realm. These stairs do move beyond the property line into the public realm, but they are allowed by the city and owned by the property owner. But they're a way of making a public statement, a way to get up to the first floor above the ground. And here you can have ironwork or masonry. You can go straight or curve, depending on the needs and the desires of the client. And of course, it's this that is one of the great delights of Savannah. Why are Savannah planned houses elevated in the first place is one of the still unanswered questions. It's not because of a low water table. Savannah is in the low country, but not here in the historic district, which is on a bluff. No problem with that. It may be for breezes. It may be for a very obvious reason to put the kitchen and utilities down below. For many of the antebellum examples, to have enslaved people below you and have the gracious living areas above. But raising above the ground is one of the hallmarks of Savannah's architecture, and one of its great delights. One of the great delights here, I guess I don't have a picture of it, is the view that one gets standing on the stair, especially a covered porch, looking out onto the square that is in your front yard. It's a great sense of almost being in a country house and yet in an urban townhouse. Of course, as we said, houses are also built on trust lots, and it's these that are among the largest and the most magnificent of all. We've said already that many of these return to the public realm as this house, which was a bank and then a restaurant, a house museum. This one is now demolished. Here, another house museum. This used as a corporate headquarters, and here is a B&B. You can see in the style of the examples I've given here a great variety in how every side of the building is being designed in some fascinating way. One of the most fascinating of these is the Moses Eastman house. This house goes by many different names, which has this massive portico on the front. This was actually added in 1911, replacing a half-sized portico. So it's in the spirit of the original. And it is simply a side porch. The front entrance is here on the east-west street, monumental in its own small way, but it is facing the square. It's the magnet of the square that prompts Charles Kluski in his redesign of this to create this colossal order porch to give a sense of public address to public space. So one other type that we should mention here is the Savannah Mansion House on a tithing lot. And I've already mentioned them, so we'll just do it again. There's some houses that look like they should be on trust lots end up on those inner tithing lot sites. And in many cases, you could just pick it up and move it to the trust lot, except in the case of the Sorrell house, where it gets even wider. So in many ways, Sorrell is doing something here that could not have been done on a trust lot. Many of the same principles you find here. You'll notice both on the trust lots and tithing lot mansion houses that double stairs are not infrequent. Houses of worship follow similar principles, such as we mentioned. They face the square, they have bold monumental gestures toward the square. They're linear and elongated. There's a variety of style here, from classical to Gothic, and a variety of dates right into the 20th century. Church building remained quite vibrant, and of course there are a variety of denominations as well, including two Jewish synagogues, which I didn't show in this slide. Now, the church design in Savannah is the other typology that I thought we should just mention here for a moment. 60 by 180 foot lots, as we said, are quite narrow, and really too narrow to have a single auditorium running the full length of them. And so the churches often pull up to the front with a back left over. Inevitably, what happens, almost inevitably, is that these churches decide to add Sunday school or administrative spaces on the back, such as you can see here, forming these clustered buildings of various kinds. And you can see that in actual examples here. I refer to these as trailer buildings or caboose buildings. Maybe that's a better word for it. I think in the Lutheran Church, that's quite apparent. Here is the late 19th century church with its finials and its tower that's pulling toward the center of the square. And here is the Sunday school building being pulled along, like the caboose on a train. Similar scene here with Trinity Methodist. Or here you have First Baptist, where the caboose building is actually across the street, but still and designed in a very similar style. Or here with the Congregational Church, a more modern style of church. It too has that same basic principle, uniquely Savannah building type, I would say. Here's the synagogue, Mikvah Israel. Similar, the caboose building in a similar style to the front building. These two actually back up to each other across Drayton Street. Wesley Monumental with this rather monumental Sunday school building. That idea of the caboose, of pulling the secondary, the later building behind, can be seen in other structures, not just churches. For example, the Telfair Academy, where we have a former house turned into a museum, and when it was turned into a museum, the windowless box-like section of the museum being pulled along like a caboose along the trust lot. Now, I want to bring this to a kind of climax by looking at a couple more churches, but in doing this, I want to raise another set of issues that are important to Savannah in this dialogue between architecture and urbanism. Here is the Independent Presbyterian Church, which is a fascinating and beautiful building in many ways. The Presbyterians came to Savannah in the 1750s and occupied two different locations before 1817, when they decided to build a new structure. Moving from Telfair Square, they purchased an entire tithing block, 5 lots here in the newly laid out Brown Ward, and decided to place the church not on a trust lot, but on a tithing. The reason is clear, that the church had grown, the congregation had grown, so that a trust lot, seen here, was not big enough. So that's the limitation of the trust lots. That is, if you want to have a congregation that's over probably 500, you're going to need to have a bigger lot. Where you're going to find it, well, in taking tithing lots and sewing them together. So the building was placed, oriented just like on a trust lot, facing its own little square here of grass, setting it back from Bull Street. The street above here is Oglethorpe Avenue, that most beautiful street in the world. And so it is prominently seen from the street, but also prominently seen from the square, which is over here at Chippewa Square. So point number one, the Savannah Plan is limiting. That is, if you have a large institution, it's hard to be accommodated by the small scale. You could say it's a failed city plan in that sense. And a number of large institutions, churches, hospitals, government institutions, have thus moved out of town to larger pieces of property rather than work with the Savannah Plan. The Presbyterian Church thought creatively about how to reuse the lane back in the 18 teens, but that doesn't stop there. What happens over time is the church continues to grow. So here is the church set back from its grassy park. When in the 1920s they needed to create more Sunday school space, they added a caboose-like building, pulled along, just as if it were on a truss lot. A little different because it has a courtyard, and it thereby creates a new condition altogether. Its own private garden court, a new entrance seen here. Later, another entrance will be added on the right. Continually evolving. Some these changes were made actually just a few years ago. So it's got this Sunday school building from the 1920s here. That was built because the 1895 Sunday school building was not enough. This one, the administration building by Charles Henry, was initially built for classrooms. This is the third iteration of that building there that sits across the lane from the church. This is currently a parking lot owned by the church. If we go down the lane, you can see a 2010 building that is more Sunday school and meeting space. And then finally in 2017, a carriage house, existing building, was purchased by the church to accommodate interns and other staff with the church, forming what is a kind of campus. And here's the principle. This is a growing church, not a mega church, it's a church of about 600 member congregation, but with a vibrant ministry of the sort that would have prompted many institutions to move to the suburbs and create a place with a facility with a large parking lot and large scale, big footprint buildings. But the IPC session decided to remain here and to use the plan to build within the constraints of the plan to create a kind of campus. And in doing so, they encouraged architectural designs that were compatible one with the other. And so a classical language is employed that builds on that of John Holden Green's design for the church. I think the most remarkable is the administration building by Charles Henry, which has these colossal Doric corner columns and chamfered walls that allow for views through the building to the church next door into the city square, into the Chippewa Square on the sides. A building that defers to the hierarchical language of the church, but clearly relates to it. And Ralph Adams Cram's building of 1928 does a similar thing on the back side. Maybe a little less successfully. The Hanson Architects in 2010 did a similar thing. And of course, this building is not related to that. In 2016, the church actually paved the laneway. It had been paved, but they gave it new pavement to tie this together. This is a publicly owned street, but it architecturally and urbanistically ties this together as a kind of campus. So it belongs to the city, but it functions as a way to tie these buildings together, and is with the carriage house now a very lively space that is used for events, for gatherings as well. It's this kind of creative thinking that I think is part of the beauty of the Savannah Plan that allows for architecture to work with within the constraints of the plan. A very similar thing happens with the Catholic Cathedral, the other large church, in fact, the largest church in the city, that occupies tithing lots and does so with a rectory behind it, with a monastery and a girls' school on the side, and out of the view are also on the trust lot school buildings, with more school buildings off to the right. Stylistically, they're not as similar as those of IPC, but in a similar way, we have a campus of buildings working within the constraints, the small scale, fine-grained, humans scaled city plan. Now, let me show you now a perhaps less successful example of this. And we'll leave churches behind and go to the United States government, in fact, the federal government. Here, we're on Telfair Square, and you can see the square in the center, and two trust lots and a tithing. These are now occupied by the Juliet Gordon Low federal buildings that were erected in the 1980s. These buildings, designed by Atlanta firm Stevenson Wilkinson, are interesting, I guess you could say, to some degree. You'll notice something about the facade of this building, which is used by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, built by the General Services Administration, the GSA. The building, first of all, let's just go back here. The main building, they're called Juliet Gordon Low Federal Buildings A, B, and C, I think is what they're called. They're all one name. But the main building, as you can see, blocked the lane. It violated the plan, I guess we could say, to create one mega building. So that's how they solved the problem of needing a big footprint. They just obliterated part of the plan. What they tried to do, however, is to give a facade that responds to the tradition of row houses and tithing units. So these expansion joints here celebrate the rhythmic pattern of houses. One might question how successfully they do so, but there is some attempt to give honor to the plan, even here with this building that's covered with ceramic tile. Granite base and ceramic tile above. And it does have that raised story, though it doesn't have a stair, of course. Across the street from that are the two trust lot buildings that function for various purposes for the federal government. And these buildings quickly gained a reputation as being called the bathroom tile buildings because of their small scale ceramic tile that you can see here. What you can see is the buildings are a kind of pastiche. They are drawing from the classical language of public trust lot building. The scale on them is very much in keeping with the intent, we'd say, of the plan. But they do seem rather like abstractions, and their footprint is so small that the government's had a hard time finding them very useful as for internal revenue system as a service, and I don't know who else was in those buildings, and ultimately they were vacated. In the 1990s, the federal government decided they needed more federal courthouse space. And so a plan was put in place by Robert A.M. Stern, architects no less, to create a large federal courthouse that would replace these two buildings and also cover the bisecting street. In other words, another plan violation. But it would be big enough to serve the needs of much needed courtroom space. And a fairly handsome design that was inspired by the existing federal courthouse, which is very nearby. This comes to naught, the economy tanks, and it's not until about 10 years later that the government decides to replace the bathroom tile buildings with this plan, which would be used as a courthouse and I think some other functions as well. And once again, the idea was to block the intervening street, this time with a clear lobby done in a rather more modernist design that would serve the needs of the city and create a kind of public building. This was roundly criticized by the city, by various groups. The Historic Savannah Foundation actually put in counter proposals. These are their drawings You can see the current buildings or the existing buildings. The GSA proposal was this, and what HSF wanted to do was to create more traditional 19th century inspired design buildings on both trust lots that would have a bigger footprint. That, of course, is rejected, and in the end, it's this design that is now under construction for just one of the trust lots. The other will remain, and a through street or a park actually will be placed rather than a street. So you can see it's a kind of compromise design, maximizing, pushing out at every little increment that it can to create a small federal courthouse. So the plan is a constraint. It's a constraint that forces architects, planners, and citizens to think about how to accommodate modern needs within that plan. My final discussion of this quality of working large institutions into a fine-grained plan brings up a couple of issues. One is, we've alluded to this, adaptive reuse. That is, many buildings in the Savannah Plan were built for one reason and are now used for some other function. This, I think, is part of the glory of having this fabric of really good architecture that allows for this kind of flexibility of usage. A great example is the Savannah Volunteers Armory, designed in 1893 by William Gibbons Preston, Boston architect who designed many other great buildings in the city. It's this Romanesque pile that functioned for a group of a military group that's used really more as a social hall. Interesting building in terms of its style in the city, rather novel in the 1890s, but one that is, of course, scaled very well with the city. It's on one of those inside tithing lots with a corner tower and balconies looking out. This building is abandoned by the later part of the 20th century, and it's in 1978 that a couple from Atlanta came to Savannah, purchased this building, and revitalized it and turned it into the Savannah College of Art and Design, the institution where I teach. And it was a crazy idea, but they thought they would start an art college in Savannah. They opened up that same year, having sanded and painted and refurbished. Classes of all kinds were held here in the class, and the college has continued to grow ever since. With a handful of students in 1978, Savannah College of Art and Design today has, I'm not even sure, 13,000, maybe more, students who attend the college. The college has remained committed to Savannah, even though they now have a campus in Hong Kong and another in Atlanta and another in France. The college is still the Savannah College of Art and Design. And how it grew is in a similar way, by creating a campus, by rethinking what a campus is, by acquiring properties, historic properties, or at least old properties, and reusing them adaptively for various purposes. Department stores turned into libraries, and retirement homes turned into computer halls, and train stations turned into art museums. Skyscrapers turned into administrative offices, et cetera, et cetera. These buildings are scattered throughout the plan so that students who attend SCAD find that they have no campus per se, but that the city is their campus. Today, there are over 70 buildings, not all in the historic district, but in the surrounding areas, all of a rather different design, but working very successfely with the city. SCAD represents, along with IPC and the cathedral and a growing number of institutions, a model for how modern needs and modern institutions can fit within this historic plan that remains flexible, adaptive. A plan which is masterful, rigorous, masterful yet multi-authored, rigorous yet elastic, and a plan in which architecture and urban design evolve together. So what I've given you here are just a few thoughts about the Savannah Plan and its architecture. There's much more that could be said, but I thank you for joining me And I invite you all to come to Savannah and see for yourself, walk the streets and the squares, and explore its architecture. Thank you all.
As we conclude our time together, let me bring you back outside. We're standing in Madison Square on a warm summer morning. You can see that Savannah is a very real city. And yet, standing here, you can also see, and more importantly, sense, that it's also a city that was formed by an ideal plan. A plan that was conceived long ago by high-minded idealists, and yet a plan that has continued to change by ongoing generations and ongoing changing ideals. Madison Square is in the middle of a ward that has been modified in a number of ways. And yet, the essential form of the Savannah plan is still apparent all around us. In fact, the ideals of Savannah, the original ideals of Savannah, in the great canopy of trees and in the generous public space, we also feel it and see it in the architecture that's all around us, an architecture that was formed and shaped by the powerful effects of the plan, a plan acting as the conductor of a great symphony. The music of that symphony is produced by an ongoing culture of buildings, which is uniquely Savannian in its motifs and rhythms. As we've studied the Savannah plan and its history, we've learned just a few lessons about how the ideal can be made real in a city like Savannah. We've learned these lessons under three observations that we've made. The first is that the Savannah plan is a masterful plan, formed by a masterful designer, and yet it's a plan that is, in reality, a multi-authored plan, changed, adapted, and modified by succeeding generations. We've also learned that the plan is a rigorous and insistent plan on the one hand, but on the other, it is fundamentally elastic, able to change. Not only is it elastic, it's multi-centered and multivalent. And finally, architecture of the Savannah plan is an architecture that is created in a continuous evolving dialogue with the process of urban design, the two working together in symbiotic relationship. The only way to really experience and appreciate Savannah, of course, come here. So at this point, I invite you all to come and see the city, walk its streets, to sit in its squares, to visit its cafes and its buildings. When you do, you might want to pick up a guidebook, an architectural guidebook. And at this point, let me just make a very shameless plug. I'm showing you here a book called The Buildings of Savannah, which was published just a few years ago in 2016 by University of Virginia Press and authored by my colleague Robin Williams and several of us in the Department of Architectural History at SCAD. So pick one of these up. Come to Savannah. I hope to see you here soon.